Hello there, and welcome to Delightful Dissent. Today it's episode 16, and I'm talking to Sally-Anne Airey. Welcome, Sally. Thank you, Sally-Anne. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Matthew.
It's great to have you on the show. And the assumption we're going to be talking about today is that I should listen to feedback. This is a really, really interesting one for me. It's something I've been told very often as well, but it's really interesting because there's something in it about how we really understand other people's perspective and how we actually get that. And this for me is really important around innovation and change as well. When we ask people what they want and what they want to be better, how we respond to that, how we engage with that is actually a very different process to the way that certainly I was taught to engage with feedback. So I'm really pleased to be talking about this one today. If you're new to the show, Delightful Dissent is really about challenging those deep assumptions and the things that may be holding us back and holding you back. And it's often the invisible ones, the ones that tend to really trip you up, that I really want to get out here and talk to people about. And it's also about giving you ideas and ways that you can go out there and challenge assumptions yourself. And not just in that kind of way of like knowing and having the answers, but really of not knowing and exploring what we don't know and working into that. Because very often we do that behind closed doors. And I really want to get that out there into the open and start to be a part of normal conversation. So the reason it's called Delightful Dissent is, we're actually challenging some ideas. We're saying, okay, we don't agree. This isn't quite the way we see things. But we're doing it in a much more positive and much more open way. We're not trying to say you're wrong and I'm right. We're kind of trying to open things up and make it a really joyful way of kind of exploring what we don't know or what we didn't know before. And this show is genuinely live. We started a couple of minutes late due to more technical issues again, which if you watched last week's episode, I still haven't fixed all those technical issues, but that's what being live does. So if stuff does go wrong, please bear with us. We are talking about some deep things sometimes on the show and some personal things, so there may be some challenging topics come up for you. We may also use strong language and talk about difficult things. So if those may be issues for you, then just be aware that those might be coming up. This show is all about engaging and having a conversation. And that's not just between me and Sally-Anne. It's about you in the audience. So if you're watching live, please do ask questions, post comments. If you post a comment, we'll see it and we can respond and anything that you want to know or that you want us to explain further, please do share. We'll also be sharing loads of contact information at the end. So if you want to carry on the conversation, you're listening to the recording, you can then catch us after that and follow that up. So please do engage. And also, as you're listening or watching, engage with it yourself. It's like we're not necessarily right about all of this stuff. So where do you think, how are you thinking about this? How are you engaging with this? Because that's what really matters. That's a huge part of all of this work. So today I'm talking to Sally-Anne Airey, and we first met, I think it was at Happy Startup School summer camp. And I was really struck by her kind of real calm level of self-containment, I think, a level of kind of self-assurance. And I must admit, I found it quite intimidating at first. It's a little bit like, it was actually so, a little bit like I just almost unexpected. But as I got to know her, I realized she's really, really doing some really wonderful work and looking at leadership in a quietly radical way. And I think that's why I really wanted to talk to her today, because we quite often talk about topics around leadership and self-leadership as well, and what that means, and I really wanted to get her view on all of this and her perspective. So I've certainly been speaking for long enough now. So Sally-Anne, could I ask you to perhaps introduce yourself a little bit about the kind of work that you do and the kind of people that you like to work with?
Matthew, thank you for explaining all of that and for the slightly quirky introduction. It's interesting to hear that. I not the first time people have said it. I think often people see me as quite calm. And I find that interesting because it's not always how I feel, but it's what people perceive. And the self-contained part, well, who knows? Yeah. But I guess it's interesting to hear that too. I work with leaders, as you said. I'm very, very interested in leadership. I was a leader once. And when I say that, what I mean is I was a leader in that I had a position called leader. And that was in the Royal Navy, which prides itself on, being rather good at leading. And I learned a lot from that. And then I left the Navy, looking for something that I hadn't quite defined. And we moved to Eastern Europe. And whilst I was in Eastern Europe and I was working as the business manager of an international school, I met a lot of local parents. And one of them one day, a Ukrainian kind of chief exec, asked me to coach one of his leaders, who, funny enough, happened to be French. It was an international organization. And I remember saying, but I'm not a coach. And he said, but I can see that you can help this man. So I said, okay, I'll do it. And I found the process of helping this leader who was leading a big department. I found the process of helping him to engage in a way that worked really interesting. And I suppose I drew on some of my own experience. And I started to kind of look at how I'd led and how I'd seen other people lead through a different lens. I suppose a more analytical lens, perhaps, looking at what works, what doesn't work, what experience I can bring forward to be useful to people. And then I learned how to coach, listening, not telling, asking, all the things that, if I'm honest, I hadn't really thought about. I just kind of did it. So I sort of started to think much more seriously about what it is to coach someone, what it is to enable someone to be their best, and then how that's aligned actually with leadership. And so the work I do now it's evolving. What I do now is quite different to what I did, 12 years ago when I started. But it's evolving into, I suppose, a way of enabling leaders to show up fully, not to try and be someone else because it doesn't work, to figure out who the hell they are and how that is of service, how that can be of service. And there might be elements of how we are that we might want to kind of work on or develop or dig deeper into. It doesn't mean that, there isn't that work still to do, perhaps. But it's very important, I think, that it comes from a place of wholeness and uniqueness and authenticity. And these words are bandied about, aren't they? But I've given quite a lot of thought to all of that. And so now the work I do is, as I put it, helping leaders align who they are with how they lead. Mm-hmm. And that's different for everybody.
That's wonderful. I think one of the recurring themes on this show is what it means to really, what some of those words that get bandied about a lot actually mean, and what it means to work with them and do them. And very much that there are many ways to express something. We think of a role, and there are actually many ways to do that successfully, and what successfully means to you. And it's much more subtle than that there's one way to solve everything. And that actually trying to do that can often be quite counterproductive. So I think it's great to think of. And I think leadership as a domain is one of those that is quite, from my perspective, quite widely misunderstood. Kind of out there, how we think about it, and I think I'd be really interested to get into some of the words and what those mean and how we're working with those, which I think is actually very pertinent to feedback and language and how we do that. But before we get too far into that, I like to ask my guests to share a quote that kind of supports them a little bit and where they're coming from before we start getting into the assumption itself. So have you got something you could share with us, Sally?
Yeah, it's a really simple one. And it's from, many of you will know, a Zen Buddhist master, Thich Nhat Hanh. I came across mindfulness quite a long time ago now, and I've attempted to practice it, or I do practice it over many years. It's obviously always work in progress. But when when I first encountered mindfulness, I found the teaching of Thich Nhat Hanh personally the most helpful, perhaps because it resonated most loudly with me. But his work I really admire. And and he has an abundant number of beautiful quotes, any one of which I could have picked for this. But the one that I find most easy to remember, to call to mind in any moment, particularly a moment of difficulty, is this: living together is an art. And I find it helpful because it reminds me that it isn't always easy, but that there's always a way. And that can often be acknowledging that we're not right, reminding us to listen, reminding us to perhaps be more understanding and compassionate towards each other, and recognize that this is a way of being which is infinitely adaptive, really.
It really brings to mind the idea that we are being creative in our conversation and in our interactions with people. And actually, I think as an idea, I find that really, really lovely as a way to think about it, is that there isn't a right way to do this. There isn't a right way to do art. So it's like just doing, it opens up all sorts of different ways of talking and interacting and conversing and doing so in a richer way, it feels like to me, than trying to say the right thing all the time, which I must admit I've spent a lot of my life trying to say the right thing.
Have you?
And it's never really worked.
No, and it might have been perfect, except that when we look at it through the lens of trying to do the right thing, we're not seeing it clearly, I don't think, possibly. But I'm very curious about that, Matthew, of how you feel that that's what you've done. Is that what's led to this program, in fact? Kind of a reaction against that a bit?
It partly, yes. I think, there's definitely a huge thing for me around that need to say the right thing for someone else that lands perfectly for someone else, that they get, that they understand completely, and to really kind of almost justify myself as well. It turns into that. So and I think it's a really interesting one, and I think this does actually get right into why the quote is really interesting, is that the giving and receiving of feedback aren't separate. And this the assumption that I should listen to feedback is really is something so often told, and that I've been told, and has actually kind of definitely been a challenge for me, but not in the way that I think it was said to me. And that is a really interesting one. So before we go to...
I'm curious to understand that a bit more, though, because I think it could be really helpful to conversation to understand it.
So I think my experience is that feedback has been, the word feedback means something quite evaluative. I think of feedback as, if I think of feedback immediately, I think of getting my schoolwork back and getting little comments in red or in green from the more progressive teachers, to where it's like, well, this is what you did wrong. And a few of them would be like, well, I like this bit, but mostly it's like, well, this is what you did wrong and this is what you should have done instead. And there's a bit of me that still thinks all feedback is basically that. And I always found it very frustrating where where there is a definite right or wrong answer, there is a way to do it. I actually found it very frustrating when we're talking about more qualitative things, and it's like, well, I see it this way, and I've actually articulated why I see it this way. It's just you disagree with my perspective, my subjective perspective. And I couldn't have said that as a teenager, but I would have just said, you're wrong and I don't like it. But but that sense of being able to separate those two things and tease those two things apart, I think, is a huge part of this listening to feedback and how people give feedback. And actually how I take that is because at school, obviously, you're always evaluated against this stuff, and it's like it's right or wrong. And now I still have a little bit of that voice in my head when I'm listening to any feedback. And also, it's the fact that you can't really talk back. You can't say, well, yeah, great. I understand where you're coming from, and it's different for me. You have to say, okay, teacher, yep, you're right. I'll do it different next time. And that's a very different thing. And I think I definitely carry some of that assumption with me when I'm in that whole space.
Isn't that interesting how we carry this? And yet, we carry it, what we sometimes do, if I may, and I'd love to pick up on it more widely, but just to pick up on that is, what we all do is we carry forward a feeling that we had in a certain situation, and then we project it into other situations which may or may not be the same, right? And then we make, so it's very interesting to hear that. And I'm kind of smiling to myself because I can relate to it. I can remember times when you just have to kind of bite your tongue and listen to it and realize that, in fact, we just got a comment coming in here from, should I pick up on that straight away? Yeah, sorry.
Or, you can, yeah, by all means. If you'd like to, we can pick up the comments at any point. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of just noticing it coming in and wanting to be responsive, and I can always come back in a moment. So Adrian here is saying, so if all feedback is biased, someone else starting from a position of how they think something should be, how can we have confidence in being able to accept it as objective and trustworthy? And I think the answer is we can't. I think the answer is we always have to remember that we're listening to feedback across two dimensions: the words that are being spoken and who's speaking them. And then there's a third dimension, actually, which is the context. So I think it is important always to evaluate in those terms and not necessarily to trust what we're hearing. Now, let's say there's a wise elder, to be very broad about it, who's, giving us some wisdom. There's going to be a greater degree of trust probably towards that person because of their position, their experience, their background, the way they show up. It might well be that I'm speaking for myself, I might listen quietly and take time to absorb it and think about it. And I'll be way more receptive towards that person than I would be if it was someone who I, in my infinite arrogance, but nevertheless, I deemed, in some way unworthy to be telling me this. So that says a lot about me. So there's another dimension, which is me. So there's the person giving it, there's the thing they're saying, the person themselves, the context, and then there's us, the receiver, and all our stuff, Matthew, that you've just alluded to, that you carry from school, is going to be influencing how you receive that. And so if we then think, if we're the feedback giver, we have to take all of that into account. So there's many different dimensions that I think, in my experience anyway, and I'm sure there's tons of exceptions, but what I've often come across is that when someone is about to give feedback to someone else, and it may be, let's say it's, critical feedback of some kind, developmental feedback, the only thing they'll be worried about is how that person's going to react. And that's the biggest thing that people come to me to talk about is, I've got to tell this person this thing. And they might burst into tears, storm off, get angry, not listen to me, and all this is going on. And they're often only thinking about it in one dimension. And so I would encourage us all, when we're either giving or receiving feedback, to think about it in a very multidimensional way, and to know that it's never black and white, obviously. And if we have to give difficult developmental feedback, that this is a question, this is an area of, you're talking to a human being. What you say to that person could have an extraordinary impact on them in one way or another. Even if they don't want to listen to it and they walk away and reject it, it's still going to have an impact. So we have a massive responsibility when we're sharing feedback with someone to make sure that we've taken account of all those dimensions. And most important of all is the human being that we're talking to. Remembering that, to divorce and separate the behavior from the human being. And if we can talk to the human being, then what we say is going to be more, more complete, more human. So Adrian, I don't know if that answers your question. It was a very random answer. By all means,
yeah. It's a really interesting one, and I think the relationship between being objective and being trustworthy is a really interesting one for me, because quite often there's something around perspective and this idea of subjectively experiencing something common, and we all have our perspective, we all have our view on it, and there's no no one can tell you that your experience of something itself is wrong. You experience it as you do. And I think when we join you were talking about kind of picking these things apart, and when we join that idea of like how we experience it with how we explain it and how we explain it to other people, when that's like tightly linked, and when that has to be the same each time and has to be the same for you, it gets very messy, and it very much becomes like one person's perspective has to be correct. And I think that is very different from, like your report of your experience is trustworthy in the sense of like, you're telling me what I can trust that you're faithfully doing that, because that's what we do. But your explanation might not be something I want to trust, or my explanation might not be something I want to trust relative to you, but it's a different thing. And I think so that relationship between kind of objectivity and trustworthiness is a really, really interesting one, and also plays into something else which is really relevant for me, which is context, and that we are all our own context, and we're always talking about different things. And I think one of the big things is people assume it's the same thing every time and it's entirely repeatable, and actually things are always different. And are we really talking about the enduring aspects of it? Are we talking about the things that we're really interested in and the things that we want to work with? Or are we talking about the circumstantial things that just kind of out of control, out of our regular control, and that yes, they have an impact, they have an influence on how we experience the thing, but they're not really pertinent to what you're trying to do or what can be controlled. They're just luck, for want of a better word.
I mean, Matthew, I think that's a really interesting observation. I mean, can you think of an example of where you've experienced that kind of thing recently or in the past?
In terms of feedback, yeah, I think it's really interesting. Certainly, that for me, that's often one of the things in terms of soliciting feedback. When you ask for something, and this is really big, because one of the reasons I'm interested in this conversation is the role of feedback in developing new ideas and developing new stuff. And when you want to serve someone, you want to help them, you're creating something to help someone, and then you ask them, what do you want, or how did that go, or what do you think about it? And then you get an answer, and quite often that answer isn't entirely in the terms that you wanted, or that you can really work with. I think the most obvious example for me is, I don't know if you've ever, sometimes you're looking at products online and you look at the reviews online, and some of them will give you an evaluation of the thing that you want to buy, and you're like, okay, good, I can tell that. And some of them will be like, no stars, bought the wrong thing. and it's like, it's that kind of feedback that's very, that where it's like, I can't, yes, but that doesn't really tell us anything.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a few good models out there, I think, that can be helpful in terms of how we approach feedback, aren't there? And one of them is, evidence-based, objective, make sure that what you're saying is, you can demonstrate, you're not talking about it sort of totally subjectively in the way that person did. But who are we doing this for? Let's ask ourselves that question too. But yeah, so I think, well, do you want to kind of, I don't want to kind of pull together the thing that you were trying to say, but in terms of what you take from this, then what is it?
I think it's an interesting thing for me, because it is at that really interesting meeting point between our subjective individual experience and something more objective, something shared, definitely. And I'm of the opinion that what we think of as objectivity is relative to our frame of existence in physics terms, if nothing else. And we are so what we're saying when we're saying objective is we share a common context, we share a common frame of reference around this. Again, in physics terms, if nothing else, because everything's different if you're in a different frame of reference. And I think actually, for me, what comes out of this is how important it is to establish that frame of reference, and how important it is to really work on to give intent and give awareness to that, rather than just jumping in and assuming that we have a common frame of reference already that works for both of us.
Yeah. So something about stepping back and checking in on that. And when you say common frame of reference, I was just thinking about being a mum. I have twin boys. They're now well into their 20s. But when they were teenagers, did I have a common frame of reference with them? We might have been living under the same roof, but their life and the way they saw life was entirely different to mine. And I probably thought that I understood it better than I did. And there was a point when they were 14 or 15, when I think I kind of, I don't know, gradually over time probably, but it felt like waking up one day and realizing that what I was doing wasn't working. And I consciously went into putting all my effort and attention into stepping into, as best I could, stepping into their shoes, which meant listening, stopping telling, stopping giving my view of how I thought they ought to be. All of that had to go, right? And all I did was listen and do my best to understand where they were coming from. And if invited, with permission, perhaps, give my perspective, but only if invited. So it took a lot of effort. It's flipping hard. It was a big switch, not that I don't think I was too draconian before, but nevertheless, I wanted to have a better relationship with them. And that meant that I, as the parent, it was my responsibility to step into their space as best I could, right? Not that they wanted me in there too much, it's their space, but you know what I mean, metaphorically. So, and what happened at the end of that year, and it was a year of me sort of making this decision and using lots of willpower, in the Christmas card that they gave me that year, they said, "This was the best year, Mum. More of this, please." So that told me a lot about feedback. In fact, I didn't really give any. And almost in the absence of, no, hang on a minute, let me be more specific. I wasn't giving feedback in that I wasn't sort of, sharing my observations of what they were doing and how they were doing it, that kind of feedback. I was giving feedback in terms of how I showed up and how I was there for them and so I was showing them I loved them. I was giving them feedback through, in another way. And they received it, and I think I did more to help them grow that year than any time I ever told them what I thought they ought to be doing. And so the feedback then was of an entirely different kind. And I don't think I thought of it in those terms. And this was, 15 years ago, probably. I don't think I thought of it in those terms, in the terms of feedback at the time. I just made a choice about the relationship I wanted to have with them. And realized that what I needed to do wasn't for them to do. That was my job, I felt. But looking back on it, I realized it was another form of feedback.
There's something I think there's something really challenging in particularly when we feel responsibility towards a person. And I think this is true in leadership roles as well as in parenting. We feel that we have some responsibility to be able to give that feedback freely, to be able to give it unconditionally and say, "This is my perspective, do with it what you like." rather than to give it in the expectation that someone will change their behavior or change in line with that feedback.
And that's great, because I think what I'm hearing there is what matters is our intention, right? I mean, two people could say the same words, and we know this, don't we? I mean, there've been experiments on this, but two people could say exactly the same words, and they would mean something entirely different depending on the intention with which they were spoken, right? And I think that's an incredibly important component of how we give feedback, whatever the feedback may be.
I think, yeah, there's something actually quite, on some level, there's something quite reassuring in that. As someone who's spent a lot of time trying to find exactly the right words to tell someone something, is that actually, with the intent that goes a lot of the way to doing that instead. And if it comes from a good place and genuinely comes from a good place, it is going to have that and be read as that, and trusting other people to be able to take that, to get that, I think is actually quite a big leap for many people. It certainly was for me.
Yeah. Is there a moment when you noticed it, where you did that and noticed that it's sort of working, so to speak?
Not specifically a moment where I did. I think looking back, I've realized I do it more and more, and I the self-censoring, and it's interesting just saying that, because I can feel it coming in when I talk about it. Suddenly there's like you can feel that urge of like, what are you saying? That little bit in your head that's like, think about what you're saying, really, like, yeah. But
I mean, I wouldn't suggest for one moment that that's necessarily unwelcome or a bad thing, because there are plenty of contexts in which it's no bad thing to filter a bit. I mean, it's, I have this model I use. It couldn't be simpler, and I call it balanced awareness. And given that awareness, we think of awareness as being a field in which we dance, right? And we tap into this field of awareness. But when I try to make it more concrete, when I'm first working with people and I'm working perhaps on some feedback that they've received that they don't understand, it's often where we start, actually. And so what I'm trying to do is make sense of it for them and try to, bring perhaps some awareness that they may not have understood, realize something about themselves, perhaps, so I'm sort of playing with it a bit and trying to figure out the right way to help them. And anyway, what I start with is this thing. I'm gonna just do this. Imagine this is a triangle, and up here is self, and here is others, and here is context. So self, others, context. And I think when we're doing anything, but when we're speaking, it is helpful, particularly if we're in a position of influence. This is my view, but that if we're in a position of influence, I think it's helpful to always bear in mind that there's a balance, I believe, between, our needs, the needs of others, and the needs of the context. And so it might be that there are times when you would choose to filter language, and that would be really quite a helpful thing to do. Because if you just kind of blurt out what you mean, it might not be fully understood or appreciated by the other people, therefore something be lost in translation in the message, and it might not be what the situation in that moment needs. And I think it is important, and I speak to leaders about this a lot, to just kind of have that frame of reference. And it might be that we need to be a little more skillful in the way that we speak about something. So I think that all of that to say that I wouldn't necessarily abandon the filter, because it can be handy, right?
It's an interesting one for me, because I think there's a big difference between channeling and expressing something authentically in a way that's appropriate to the context and to the person you're speaking to, from not expressing it.
Oh yeah, big difference.
And I think for me, that's what I mean by the filter, is it's actually stopping me saying, it's like, stop saying that, and that say something different rather than express it differently. And that I think is a very different thing. And I actually, speaking to a lot of people, I think, being able to separate those two things. Okay, I need to slow down. I need to sense into the context to figure out what the right thing, to say is a very different thing to won't say that.
No, of course, no.
And that latter, I think, is often actually what people get, or certainly what I had as the impression of how you kind of do this.
Yeah, no, and if I may speak to that a little bit, perhaps, you know, my hypothesis might be that, you know, in that situation where there's something inside that says, don't go there, don't say this, don't do it, there's some kind of fear associated with that, probably. You know, and we could start exploring what the fear might be, but we probably don't need to do that here. But there'll be something there that's holding us back, and it'll be fear-based, fear of something, right? And I think what we need to remember there, and I think this does take practice, it's much easier said than done. However, I think what we might do well to remember there is that fear is an extremely intelligent emotion. It's giving us feedback, and what we perhaps, if in the moment we decide not to say it, fine, you know, that's what it is. But then afterwards we might reflect on, okay, what was happening there? What went on there? What was I afraid of? What did I want to say, and why didn't I? And if that ever happened again, how could I say it in a way that, you know, I was used would work, would land, would resonate? And so, but listening, I think it might start with listening to the fear and not judging the fear. Sometimes what we can do is kind of judge ourselves harshly, can't we? But really look at it and go, oh, okay, that's interesting. So that thing's, okay, so what's that about? You know, and kind of look at it in slightly dispassionately or compassionately, but in a more detached way, to explore what it is that tells us that we shouldn't have done that, or that we, you know, therefore we didn't. Or it might be that we felt we did it unskillfully, and then we, you know, beat ourselves up. But all of it is coming from a place of some kind of fear that if we can get into and understand and unpick, we can find ways. Like you said, we can find ways of doing it that will land, that will, you know, with using our senses and our perhaps a bit of intuition, you know, that will land.
I think what comes out for me, and that is that the act of giving feedback is a vulnerable act. You know, it is an act of vulnerability, because you're putting yourself out there. You're putting something of yourself out there, in the same way that creating something and putting something out, it is a creative act. And I think protecting ourselves from that, you know, and the urge to perhaps protect ourselves from a response to that, or to protect ourselves from someone really doing that, because when someone does make themselves vulnerable, there's that capacity for connection that's much more profound. And if we're protecting something, then that might be something that we want to avoid. I think there's something really quite powerful in there in terms of how we're sitting with, you know, the feedback, and you also mentioned compassion, and I think that's a big part of it. And I'm really interested in the etymology of words and what's hidden in the words. And compassion means, on some level, it means shared suffering. It's kind of suffering together. And I think that as a model for how we're working with people is like, well, where is the suffering overlapping here? You know, where is the intersection of what's bothering us in this situation? Because otherwise we wouldn't be having the conversation. There must be something here. Where's the energy coming from? You know, like you say, so, you know, we've spoken on the show before about negative emotions and what that means, and like the validity of all feedback. And it's interesting for me to think of that, you know, physical sensation and then emotions as feedback, and how we engage with that, and how we're engaging with our kind of self feedback on our embodied knowing versus the verbal feedback from our head and the verbal feedback from someone else, and their physical, their embodiedness, which we usually implicitly are reading without consciously being aware of it. And so there's a huge amount of different levels and different kinds of feedback going on all at the same time, some of which we may be more comfortable with and others of which we may not be.
Yes, and it's multi-layered, absolutely. And I was thinking, you know, when you were saying earlier about vulnerability, you know, I think if we are able, in the moment of noticing that we're struggling with how to say something, is just to say, I'm finding this really difficult. I'm struggling a bit to find the right words, but, and just say that.
Mm.
And probably in saying, I'm finding this hard, I'm struggling, and you might, seek to explain why. It could be multi reasons why. And then, do your best to express it. And then the other person might, jump in and help you. And then it becomes a dialogue. It's not, one person listening whilst the other one reports feedback. It's a connection. And chances are the meaning of what we intend will be far stronger if we form a connection of some kind. And I would take that a little bit further and suggest that, feedback works best when it's done over time, in trust, in a relationship of two human beings, so that whatever we ever say to someone is never a shock or a surprise. It's part of, working together. And to me, that's the most natural and most helpful kind of feedback, and the kind that usually helps people, develop, grow, become more of themselves over time, as if that's done in that way. I think the worst in the world is the kind of annual performance review discussion where you kind of go in trepidation, wondering what the boss is going to say. I mean, that's just not how to do it at all.
Yeah, being evaluated on kind of slightly arbitrary, hidden, often quite capricious levels of, like what matters. What matters in the moment is always going to be really stressful. It's actually, it's in some ways, it's one of the ways that psychologists use to create stress when they want to stress subject to create social stress. Is a set, you have to, you're expected to follow a set of rules, and the rules keep changing and you don't know, and so it's a hugely stressful situation to be in. And I think that idea of feedback never, getting to the point at which feedback is not a surprise is really, really interesting. And for me, there's something again about that openness, and the openness about as an ongoing practice, rather than as a, I'm going to be honest with you now. It's like, well, what were you doing before?
Really don't want to hear that. No, I mean, I think a lot of people are much more aware of that now than, dare I say, they used to be. I think cultures often are way more open about that now than in the past. However, I have worked in organizations where that isn't the case, and even in the open cultures where there are still people who struggle with it. And even if even if the criteria against which one is being evaluated are clear, if there might be agreed objectives for the year, say, there might be agreed competencies, everything might be very clear, actually, and yet the feedback can still, be surprising or worse, still shocking. So the real clarity is in the connection between the people involved.
So if someone wants to move their feedback on either side of this equation, and I think this is one of the really interesting things, is for almost all of us, we both give and receive feedback in different ways. So we have both, we play both roles in this. So if someone wants to move any of the relationships in which they give or receive feedback in towards the kind of direction that we've been talking around, towards being more open and being more compassionate, and how could they start going about that? What might they be able to do?
I think they might ask themselves, how well do I listen? And be really honest about it. How well do I actually listen? They might experiment with, next time they're in a conversation, speaking far less and listening more, noticing when they're going into telling mode and, pulling back from that. And so starting to become more aware of the times in which they're sort of, sharing their stuff rather than listening to other people's. And if someone were, about to go into a feedback session because it had been scheduled and they didn't feel prepared, they hadn't done any of the stuff I just suggested, say, and the things in the diary and it has to be done, then I think I would suggest do your very best to step into that person's shoes. And when you're giving your feedback, set the intention to put them as human beings front and center. And I think if we do that, it changes not only what we're going to say, but how we're going to say it.
I think for me, what comes up when you talk about stepping into someone's shoes is that's not a process of what you would experience if you were sat where they, if the roles were reversed. It's not that. It's actually feeling into and asking questions about and engaging with their unique experience and the way that they're different and the way that they're reading this differently to you. And I think this is one of the things it's one of my big problems with the golden rule, treat others how you want to be treated yourself, is that actually, okay, as a first approximation, that's better than not. But we want different things and we engage with different things. And one of the great things about being different is that one of us can give freely and abundantly one thing, and one of us and can, to the person from whom we can receive something freely and abundantly that's completely different. And if we were all the same, it wouldn't work, And I think that understanding the difference and it being okay not to have to ask those questions and to say, okay, I don't quite understand this. I don't understand this about you and why this is. And it can feel like a very personal question, but I think I've never experienced anyone turn around and say, well, I'm not telling you how I really, I'm not giving you my perspective once they've given the feedback, because it's like, it's actually the more important part, and it lets you triangulate the feedback. It lets you understand where they're coming from and whether that's actually useful to what you're trying to do. I think that's the other thing, is because not everyone gets quite why you do what you do and what you're trying to do, and it's great to get feedback, but it's like, well, is the problem that they don't get it? But I'm trying to do the thing, we're agreed on what we're trying to do, but I haven't conveyed it clearly or in a way that landed for them. Or is it actually that we're just trying to do different things with this, and that's okay? We just and teasing those things apart is really important. But that questioning and getting out there and engaging actively with it, and not questioning someone's reason for like why do you say that, is, well, why do you say that can be phrased two very different ways. Exactly, is a really great example of what you were saying earlier about how you can say exactly the same words and mean something very different.
Yes, I mean, you sort of hear, don't you, where you read that the why question is a question to avoid, and I think that's probably reasonable advice a lot of the time, but it's by no means universal. And we can ask a why question in a very empathic and compassionate way, and it can be just fine. I was thinking when you were talking just then as well about how might that play out. When you're in a conversation with somebody, you're stepping into their shoes, and let's say it was necessary. How are we doing? Okay for time, but let's say it was necessary to share something with that person about something that they'd said or done, because there'd been repercussions and so it's necessary to talk about it. And I suppose a way of stepping into their shoes might be, simply to ask them, when referring to that incident, referring to that thing, what was going through your mind? Can you tell me a bit more about, what you had in mind when you did that? What outcome were you looking for? And that can be a way of unpicking and understanding and helping them to see that maybe there might have been another way, or something, but just to kind of step in and invite them to explain, and that also is in service of inviting their reflection and their awareness and so on. That kind of thing can be, I think.
It's really interesting because I think we often kind of assume that people's intent and their way of carrying it out is pretty much transparent, that it goes that we can transparently carry out our intent, and that's absolutely not true in complexity. And we kind of know that on some level, though I think often, so certainly I definitely beat myself up when I don't manage that a little bit, and it's a habit I'm trying to unpick slowly, but we also assume that on others. And you're like, I often think of, I don't know if you ever watch, football commentators, and they're like, why did he do that? Why did it's like, that wasn't the right thing to do. It's like,
it's kind of rhetorical.
He wasn't trying to do that. It's like, it wasn't like, he didn't think, well, if I do that, that'll be brilliant. And I think we often kind of make that mistake, that kind of commentator's mistake, when we're thinking about trying to give feedback, and it's not helpful to give that kind of no one benefits from that. It's like you don't like hearing it is it's just it's what because you can't work with it. It was like, well, yeah, clearly I wasn't trying to do that. And
I think that can happen. I think the football commentator is a great one, because he's or she is frustrated, right? Why do they do it? And we're all shouting at the screen and all that stuff. It's what we do to kind of vent our frustration, I suppose. But often we can go, if we find that we're going into a feedback conversation, say, and it's emotionally charged, or we are emotionally charged, better not to. Better to, take a moment, step back, breathe, pause, and make sure that we're seeing things clearly before we go in. Because chances are, if we go in with any kind of, well, there might be a little bit of charge. Sometimes charge is helpful, but if we kind of know, if we're honest with ourselves, it's not a desperately helpful charge, then it's really better not to. Chances are we'll say something we regret.
I think giving yourself the space and the time, allowing that, and it not being needing to happen right now with that emotional urgency and pressure.
We feel we have to do it, and there's something in us driving us to. And if we can just stop it, almost kind of physically pull ourselves back, it's I know from personal experience, it's a good idea.
I think I often like to kind of wrap up and end the show with by talking about something that people can stop doing, as well as something that people can do, because there are many people on the internet telling you that there are more things you should be doing. I like to tell people what they don't have to do anymore, what they don't have to worry about anymore a little bit. So if this assumption, if I should listen to feedback isn't as true, or isn't true in the way that perhaps we've received it, what don't people have to do anymore?
First thing that comes to my mind, I'm just going to say it, Matthew, is you don't have to beat yourself up anymore.
I think that's for me, I think I'd almost move it and that equally, about on either side of the feedback, giving and receiving. I think for me, that's been the thing that's landed is that, it is very co-constructed, and that we have agency and on both sides, and power on both sides of the cycle, and not beating ourselves up, which very often leads to us expressing that to other people in unhelpful ways as well. Is a great way of starting to move that forward and open that conversation up. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're coming to the end of the show now, but I think it's been a really interesting conversation. And if people want to get in touch with you or carry on this conversation, is there any way you'd particularly like them to get in touch? How would you like people to reach out?
Oh, well, probably by email, I guess, or, and that you can get through my LinkedIn profile, through my website. I'm also on Twitter and on Instagram. Anyway is fine. And
cool. And we've shared the link to those in the description. So at least to the website.
So through the Skillful Leaders website is just fine. And I'd be really open to continuing any conversation about this, for sure.
That's great. And have you got anything coming up, any content or any programs or anything coming up that for people who are really, really interested in developing this kind of thing further, that they might be interested in?
Well, I run, I think for people who are very interested in kind of doing deeper work around leadership, I run an annual leadership program that is called Evolving Leadership. And it's very much in the spirit that this is a continually evolving process. And I always make it clear to all the people on the program that I'm evolving too. And that, this is the third program we're just about to start. We're starting it this month. It'll run through to November. And, it's quite different from the first program I ran 2 years ago. So that is an annual program for anybody who would like to engage in evolving their leadership, discovering who they are as a leader and how they might bring more of that into how they lead. So that's, quite a deep commitment. But if people want to kind of, just explore more on a one-on-one basis, then I do work with people individually to explore the same kind of theme on a one-on-one basis.
That's great. Thank you so much. It's really interesting, and I genuinely think it's actually really quite important to think about how we lead and self-lead and do this work. And the inner stuff is often glossed over in this stuff. And it is actually, for me, my experience is actually, it feels like the hard work. That's where the work is almost. Everything else becomes much easier when you do that. All the stuff I thought was important and was the work actually falls away, and that it's actually a very joyful thing. Once you start engaging with it, it opens up a lot of possibility. So I'd urge anyone who is interested in exploring this in general to explore it in whatever means, and if and to reach out to Sally-Anne as well, because she does brilliant work. And if you do get the chance to go and visit her in one of the residential things, she lives in a beautiful part of southeast France and mountains, where I've been, and it's a wonderful space to do this kind of slightly difficult work sometimes. So thank you so much for joining us, Sally-Anne. It's really great to have had you on the show. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew, and I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks a lot.
Great, I'm glad. Thank you everyone for watching, and thank you Adrian in particular for your comments, and the last one that that we could that the show could become a training ground for future football commentators. I see a niche in the market here, commentator coaches as well as football coaches. Seems like an interesting one to play with. I'm gonna go away and give that some thought, actually. Thank you so much for watching, everyone, and for engaging, and do share any of this if it's resonated for you, and share what your thoughts are on it with other people, because that's actually really how this spreads. It's the conversations and the thoughts that this stuff sparks that's the way it works. And so please do go out there and do that for yourself. I hope that today's episode really got you thinking, and that you can it's given you something useful. The next episode, next week's episode, I'm going to be speaking to Ben Tucker about the assumption business isn't personal, which I think that quite often these things kind of flow together, and it's entirely unintentional. I'm not sure people believe quite how unintentional my scheduling and planning is. It's literally, I have conversations, and when people are interested, I book them in, and then it happens. But the business isn't personal feels like it really pertains to this, and that kind of experience of our whole selves in work, and how we're talking to people at work, and how we're engaging with other people who are living, breathing human beings in what we do for a living, is absolutely really important. So I think it's really nice that these two have lined up that way. That will be at 1 p.m. UK time on Tuesday the 9th. So rather than Thursday, it will be Tuesday the 9th of March. So that's next week. Thank you very much for watching. That's all apart from me to say, go out there and make some delightful dissent for yourself. Thanks and goodbye.
Bye.